My name is Isabelle Fukushima, and I'm one of the co-facilitators here with Dalida María Benfield. And welcome to our Mobility and Temporality during COVID-19 Salon, which is a salon of Migratory Times, Institute of Impossible Subjects, and CADSR, the Center for Arts, Design, and Social Research. Um, I am a founding member of the Institute of Impossible Subjects and a co-editor for the Migratory Times publication. Just as a quick reminder, as I am speaking and as anyone else is speaking, if you are not speaking, if you could please mute. Thank you, everybody, for joining this salon. We're going to continue on. Just a little bit about the Institute of Impossible Subjects is that we are a transnational feminist collective that has been in conversations that frame issues of migration, geopolitics, decolonization, race, and gender. We are collaborative with we've been working with the Center for Arts, Design, and Social Research, in which we commission cultural interventions and artworks, producing Creative Commons licensed publications on our platform, Migratory Times. I'm joined today by my colleague, Dalida María Benfield, who will say a little bit more about herself, as well as the Center for Arts, Design, and Social Research.
Hi, everyone. So welcome to this gathering, and thank you so much for being here. We think this is a really important time to revisit the questions of mobility and temporality, and to do so with an amazing group of people such as yourselves who have expertise and activist histories and are deeply engaged in thinking about the politics and cultures of not only the locations you're in, but then the interconnections between different global locations and how they relate to questions of feminist thought, of activist thought, of the politics of migration and movement, and also how time is constructed across different epistemic and cultural sites. And also in different ways, I think each of you really working to produce new spaces of interconnection. The Center for Arts, Design, and Social Research is a mobile and global platform for bringing people together. We support artists and researchers with fellowships, and then also we bring people together in residencies and workshops. There are folks here who, when you introduce yourselves, we'll find out you've been involved in center projects and also in projects of the Institute of Impossible Subjects. And so I just really appreciate the kind of interlacing of different histories that this group of people brings. Thank you, and I really look forward to our conversation.
Thank you. I just want to thank everyone that's able to join us. I also want to remind folks that this conversation is being recorded, and a final edited version will be uploaded to the Migratory Times website. And so for our colleagues who are speaking and anyone that wishes to speak, know that there'll be an opportunity to review this before it goes up on the website. And so today's musings for this conversation, you'll find a lot of the content on the migratorytimes.net website. And so I really encourage folks to engage with the content that is available there, since there's such a range of content from text, video, poetry, and imagery. And so please visit the website. Moving forward, I just want to thank our colleagues, our sponsors, our collaborators. Sponsor's not the right word. It's really our collaborators or colluders for co-facilitating today. And so for today's conversations, you will hear from colleagues, Crystal, Jose, Critical Diaz, Anyely, and Rebecca, Latipa, Romeo, Jackline, Isabel, Alejandro, Jennifer, and Daphne. So you'll be hearing from those folks in the order in which they will share their musings about mobility and temporality. And so without further ado, I am going to turn it to our colleagues. And just as a reminder is we each will about 5 minutes, uninterrupted 5 minutes. And so we'll start with Crystal.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be in your virtual presence. And Annie and Dalida, thank you so much for organizing this, and all of you for joining. So really briefly, the two sources that I shared, I want to pair them because you know, I think the Dory Midnight piece, some of you might be familiar with her. She's a longtime community-based intuitive healer who's really been committed to collective liberation and self-determination, and draws on sort of multiple lineages, but really primarily disability and healing justice and diasporic Judaism for her practices. But her piece, I think it was shared by Adrienne Marie Brown on Instagram, and that's where I first read it. And it's a beautiful poem, and I read it right when, I think it was in the beginning of March, when the quarantine had just started. So here in California, where I am, it started a little bit earlier, I know, than other parts of the country in the US. But there's a particular stanza that is really powerful, and it's the fourth stanza, and I won't read, maybe I'll just read one line. She says, "It has already been time." You know, it's already been time to move with care and intention. It's always been true that people have been living with one lung, with immune systems that have been compromised. And it really reminded me of how, you know, even as sort of COVID-19 has been experienced as sort of exceptional time, as extraordinary time, as something that's also been sort of unevenly, in terms of the impact, it's been sort of unevenly felt, right? That it's also been an amplification of sort of these existing iniquities that already exist. So how do we sort of think about exceptional time as both extraordinary, but also an amplification of sort of the mundane and the everyday? So that's just something that I've been living with and sort of thinking about sort of within my own community, sort of caregiving for different people. Both my partner and I had elders in our lives that we've been caregiving for. So I'm just thinking a lot about exceptional time and how it's juxtaposed with everyday time. And then the second piece, I used to be a pretty avid sort of diary writer growing up, and it's a practice that I dropped, you know, in my late 20s, but something I've been going back to. And I've been keeping a diary since sort of the stay-at-home self-quarantine order in early March, and just sort of sporadically writing. And I was just piecing together different words, sort of a grammar, I guess, for thinking about time, and sort of highlighting different words that came up. And I think what was so funny in sort of putting together these, again, very different words is thinking about, again, you know, I think for a very long time we've been living with so many different contradictions and oppositions, and there are ways that I think COVID-19 has, again, amplified those kinds of oppositions. And what does it mean to feel these very different things simultaneously, right? So COVID-19 as a time of simultaneity, and then thinking about how time is structured both sort of normatively through metrics, through numbers, through intervals, you know, both through sort of the literal marking of time, but also like through statistics. So thinking about like the statistics that have been related to COVID-19, so the accumulation of the sick, those who have passed away, but also time is beyond those sort of normative metrics. Time as something that's deeply felt, something that's deeply sensed, and sort of what does it also mean to live in relationship to, intention with, and against racial capitalism. So those are some very sort of, I guess, quote unquote, random things I've been thinking about in relationship to time and mobility. So I'll keep it at that.
Thank you. Jose.
timer for myself so that I make sure to respect everybody else's time, because time is not really making sense to me right now. So I'll just say what I shared is a piece of performance art by an artist named Guillermo Pena. I've always been influenced by his art because to me it has rendered the conditions of post-coloniality that remain productive to me, in the sense that to me post-coloniality does not mean a time after colonization and after violence, but the residues and effects that continue to stay with us even when we think that we're beyond and after these times. So these uncanny returns to violence that we enact even when we think that we're engaging in resistance. And his work has always rendered that condition for me. In particular, this condition of the impossibility of knowing that drives most of my work. So the question that I wanted to center this around is the question that drives most of my thinking is, how do we answer the call, the demand of the other, when that call comes from the missing, the dead, the unknowable, and those we lost along the way? This comes from my own lived history. My father's a migrant from central Mexico, and I've always been had sort of this like melancholic relationship to this lived history and family history that I'll never be able to know and recover, that is lost in the act of escaping violence in the diaspora. So I wanted to move on. How do I disrupt this desire to know the other, to extract their knowledge, to make it into a commodity, given that I work and my paycheck comes from the academic assembly line? So what does it mean to do and think about this, and to have fidelity to those subjects that I work with? Is it possible to make community without the prerequisite of knowing someone? So all this comes to this Tired of Walking North poem. This is embodied tiring work, and I've never taken seriously the role of my body in the material in doing this work and asking these questions, to the point that when COVID hit, I realized just how seriously burnt out and on the edge of like my body completely failing I was, because that's what the tenure track demands from you. And in particular, I want to read this one stanza down at the bottom that just sort of, embodies what I felt as this all hit. Wait, what's happening to me? I was possessed by Reverend Billy for a second, or did I drink too much in the dressing room? Where am I? Oh yeah, I am writing my script of hope while speaking up in front of my peers. I'm looking for living metaphors, unlikely connections, open doors. I'm crying for a vision. So I'm in the space of asking a lot of questions right now. What happens after the end of the world? What happens when time bends beyond recognition, beyond the living, beyond me? And this is really uncomfortable work that makes me tired, but in a different way, once that I recognize my emplotment within this weird and funky and still foreign academic assembly line. So a lot of questions that I have to offer today. So thank you.
Thank you. Critical Diaz, Anyely, and Rebecca.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for having us. And yeah, I mean, we're excited to be forming part of this space at this particular moment in time. And it's been an opportunity to think about the time of COVID and in what way it has or hasn't allowed a kind of thinking space or critique space. Or one of the questions that was very hot in my mind at the beginning, like the first few weeks, was in what way is COVID like HIV and AIDS? In what way is it like yellow fever? In what way is this virus going to be kind of instrumentalized as a tool of governance, or is it something else? And I was kind of really stuck in this question, wanting to know what COVID is. And at the same time, in this kind of rush to know and judge COVID, I also had the feeling that all of the kind of moral and analytical frameworks available to me were not going to work in this situation, and particularly words like resistance or critique, care, home, like refuge, networks. All of these words were kind of radically unstable. So yeah, just thinking now this curve of time within COVID time space, like what is this possible difference between the space of critique or holding a space of critique, and how quickly that can turn into a kind of machine of judgment. And the project that Anyely and I had been working on just before the quarantine was an exhibition of the work of Pratibha Palmer, who has a really incredible documentary work called Reframing Aids, which traces just this process of instrumentalizing a virus and turning it very rapidly through kind of televisation or through media or through kind of flows of semiotic, linguistic, technological machinery into a tool of government. So it became a way to introduce, you know, key changes to migratory control system protocols, to police surveillance, police presence, and surveillance of public space and national borders. So the virus becomes this kind of racializing tool. And a lot of the artistic responses to HIV and AIDS evidence this transformation of something that could have been a critique of kind of capitalist structures of care and knowledge production into a machine of judgment, no? A machine that invents objects of study like sex and sexuality and the body in order to evaluate them as good or bad, or included or excluded. So quite interested in keeping present the kind of queer anti-racist response to HIV and AIDS as a demand to not know or to cease knowing, in the sense, you know, that equates as you will stop knowing about us, you must simply care. So in that sense, holding a critical space becomes this practice of suspending judgment. So obviously, you know, COVID is not HIV and AIDS. And that was very clear in the first few weeks when COVID was acting as a kind of critique and bringing into relief in our context the kind of very unsustainable levels of poverty, but also the very sustainable response in the form of what is being called cajas de resistencia, or very invisible but functional kind of mobile networks led mostly by and for kind of migrant communities who are not able to walk around public space in the same way that other people can, you know, because of the threat of being stopped by police or whatever. And obviously the way that COVID brings to the surface the complete dispensability of the excesses of travel. And so just wanted to close by thinking about how can we kind of keep COVID time space as a space of critique before it becomes kind of territorialized or televised and potentially even zoomed into a machine of judgment.
Sí, bueno. Dalida, ¿me traduces? Sí, para en medio de esta conversación con Rebeca, como que simultáneamente, para mí el tiempo del COVID ha sido también un tiempo del regreso a querer saber qué pasa en mi país, ¿no? Qué pasa en Venezuela. Y se ha producido un masivo regreso de migrantes que todavía están caminando desde Ecuador, desde Colombia, intentando entrar por las fronteras de Colombia, también por la frontera de Brasil, y esto ha generado unas imágenes que son terribles, también imágenes que pueden ser muy, muy fuertes, de mucho la fuerza que hace a la gente moverse, ¿no? Que siempre es algo que se valora mucho, pero para mí este ha sido un tiempo también un poco de estar un poco paralizada frente a la pantalla, de ver el regreso masivo de gente que ha querido irse de distintas formas de horror, y en medio de una pandemia ha tenido que regresar. Entonces hay un tiempo allí detenido y una pregunta de qué es la casa y cuál es el refugio de estos migrantes en el momento en el que la pandemia declara quédate en casa y lávate las manos, ¿no? Es una pregunta sencilla, pero que es dónde he estado.
So I can begin, maybe, and then Rebecca can pick up. Yeah, Anyely sharing that. So in the middle of this ongoing conversation with Rebecca, in the middle of the pandemic, while being very present to it, it's also been for her a moment to return to thinking about what's happening in Venezuela, her home country. And there's been an ongoing movement of people across the borders to the surrounding countries. And it's a kind of a force that has a lot of power and value, but there's also a sense of being paralyzed in front of the screen, a kind of screen of horrors. And the question of, for these people, then, what is home? And what is a refuge? And maybe Rebecca, you could add, I feel like I'm missing a point in the middle. If you could please translate.
I think just, it was, yeah, I think Anyely said that sounded right. But maybe just to amplify this point of what is the meaning of house and refuge, which has been very codified by COVID when you're mobile, and when that notion is shifting, and when the only message of collectivity from the government is wash your hands.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Is that it? I just want to, from Critical Diaz?
Yeah, I think.
Okay. Thank you, gracias. Latipa.
Hi, everyone. I'm also going to set a timer. And is it possible for me to share my screen? Is that?
Let's see. I actually set it so it wasn't possible because I was worried.
Yeah, no, then don't worry about it.
Okay, thank you. You can always send me the images afterwards, and then I can transpose them in. Yeah.
No worries. So my musing, or the beginning of my musing, is actually this book. For many different reasons. I began it, it's kind of one of those books I began many years ago and never finished, and this time gave me the opportunity to actually finish it. And with that journey, I was just so struck by how fitting Parable of the Talents by Octavia Butler is for our current moment. For those of you who are unfamiliar, the book is the second part of a series that basically tells the life of a character named Lauren Oya Olemina. who, you know, comes of age during a time of intense Christian fundamentalism and repression in the world. And basically her task, her life task, is to follow a dream she has where humanity can basically live in the galaxy, in the stars, to take root in the stars. And so she develops an autonomous community called Acorn, and goes through many trials and tribulations before finally, at the end of her life in 2090, at the age of 81, she finally sees this dream realized with ships taking off for space. And so, you know, I think that Parable of the Talents in particular brought me to the space of really thinking not only planetarily, but galactically. And, you know, in my own artistic practice, it's been so important for me to, I think, navigate how it is that one can inhabit multiple times and spaces, and how that can be offered or signified or experienced in an artwork. Some of the images that I'd hoped to show you are actually from a recent work that I developed that's called the Archives Fold, which is a multi-image slide installation that's organized as a correspondence between my great-great-grandmother and my great-great-great-granddaughter between the years 1905 and 2123. And they're both named Latipa, and that's kind of a backstory for how with this year I chose to take on that name as my the name that I would work with. But this correspondence between women across generations is one that does take place intergalactically. It's a correspondence between the dead and the yet to be born. It's a negotiation on the one hand with a whole deluge of images, whether they be images that I had, you know, been actively researching in U.S. colonial archives of the Philippines, or, you know, these images that we're deluged by on a daily basis of the world, you know, more often than not framed asymmetrically through Western gaze. And ultimately, this great-great-granddaughter Latipa's attempt to negotiate what all of these images mean, because as she's migrating to Proxima b, which is supposedly the planet that could support life, this has been quickly debunked, but I actually was interested in that obsolescence of that knowledge. At any rate, this great-great-granddaughter en route to Proxima b has been offered all of the images of the world, supposedly. And so this correspondence between the two Latipas begins precisely because she cannot make sense of the images that have been given to her. And she looks to her great-great-grandmother for some insight in that. And the great-great-grandmother basically tells her that that kind of visualization or presentification that she's looking for in these images does not exist, right? The kind of, I guess, genealogy that she seeks, you know, is not present in the archives that she will ever be given. And so I know I'm just about out of time, but I think that I just want to end with I'm saying that I think a lot of my project right now is thinking about, on the one hand, you know, how to care for the memories of the dispossessed, and how it is that we work in this kind of space of the cosmic or the intergalactic to think about alternatives or possibilities for our present moment that are beyond the kind of narratives and tropes that we want to cling on to. And I think that Butler's book is so good at showing us a path toward that. Thank you.
Thank you, Latipa. Romeo.
So I'm gonna time this one too. And I actually wrote something down so that way I stay within that time frame. Okay, so I found the Omera piece on Facebook, and people were negotiating or debating its origins. And it was actually written during this time. And I found it fitting in thinking of questions of mobility and temporality, particularly against the backdrop of privilege, the privilege to think of healing or to ask questions of healing or to think of activity in a precarious space and time. And so the pandemic, I think, has essentially stopped many of us in our tracks. And I guess, we can say that time has also stopped for some. And my family back home in South Texas have indeed stayed home. And but I turned to this poem for two different reasons: for the idea of hope that exists within the words, and for the question of privilege. Who has the privilege to heal in this precarious time? And so I do think it opened up the possibility for me, at least, to learn how to question, how to live and think differently. But I think that was only temporarily. So I like to place emphasis on a phrase that stuck out to me in the poem. It says, and the people were still. And so still could have two interpretive meanings. And the people were still there, as in remained, or the people were still, as in people were stationary. And it is the latter that really strikes me as odd because of the juxtaposition between activities such as reading, exercising, playing, and the phrase "we're still." So, and I think we see the privilege here, even amidst this exceptional time of immobility, of what it means to be mobile or active, how certain people conceive of space and time based on, their circumstances. And I'm reminded very briefly of Tim Creswell and how he speaks of a politics, say, from moving from A to B. But for me, in this exceptional time of immobility, I wonder how the movement from A to B looks so differently. And perhaps, for a moment, I did believe it was possible to think of people and the earth as both healing. I thought, for one, I could catch up on work, I could exercise, I could read, I could be with my family differently. And I have done little of movements, and the movements I have done have been so tiring. And so I've been thinking a lot lately of like how time doesn't stop, how life doesn't stand still, how our children don't stand still. They still have needs. How our partners don't stand still. They still need conversations and us being with them. Our animals don't stand still. They need love and they need to be walked. And so the stress of life, is exacerbated by the mundane things that have not become so mundane. The books on my bookshelf are way far, are far for me to reach. Sometimes day to day, and it feels like I've exercised every day for hours on end, but my body feels so tired, more tired than normal. And so I turned to this poem first because I once believed in this expression of hope, of healing, but second because I'm reminded daily of how people's circumstances differ so much. Omera speaks of a danger that will pass, and it will pass, and many of us will be reminded, I think, of what we have known. Some will always have healed at the expense of others. And so just today, I'm thinking about who has the privilege to heal and who has the privilege to ask those questions about healing and remaining active, and in a time where, people's lives are being, are crumbling. So, yeah.
Thank you, Romeo. We'll hear next from Jackline.
Oh, hi. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
So I shared an image. Let's see. I shared this image on Twitter from Twitter of a man sitting down, and it had something to do with how productivity was and what productivity is going forward. And that, in a way, reminded me of Arundhati Roy's essay, "The Pandemic is the Portal." And what that essay essentially, what she talks about when she says that what the virus has done is to halt the engines of capitalism just temporarily enough to allow us to, examine and see if this is working for us or not. And that image around productivity, and I've just been thinking about so many of these ideas in terms of what has always been termed radical, like universal healthcare, a cosmopolitan approach to a health crisis, or even like the things that we've been talking about, and the things that have been termed as radical for the longest time are now, they're now actual viables. And I think that looking at and reading Arundhati Roy's essay, for me, that was what the essay did for me, was to provide a lens and a language through which I could process what's happening. And I think that her metaphor of the pandemic being a portal, in terms of thinking about that in terms of time, and when she calls to the reader saying, how will we leave this pandemic, and what are we taking through the portal? And I've been thinking about all these ideas of like things that have been normalized, like what is in the developing world versus what is a developed world, and all these ideas around healthcare. For example, I was talking to a friend of mine in New York, and I said that I have access to like a test for the virus. All I need to do is call a toll-free line. And we laughed about it because she was in a developed country and couldn't have access to this. And just looking at how all these ideas and things and how we've been thinking for the longest time has all of a sudden changed, and it's changing, and then it's up to us to decide what we are taking and what we are leaving. And I guess in reading Arundhati Roy, I was thinking about even the portal and the element of hope that is attached to that, in terms of just the idea that the idea that everything that people have been working towards, say activists who have been pushing for remote working for people with disability, or activists who have been pushing for universal healthcare, or activists on the continent who have been saying that media for the longest time has covered different African countries from a very racist perspective. And then all of a sudden we have all these things coming to light. We have, it's just at this particular time, I've been thinking about so many different things and how they all come together to just form this soup, and it's up to us to pick what we are taking and what we're leaving. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Oh, great. Thank you, Jackline. Next, we'll hear from Isa. And Isa will have to.
Okay, I'm really not very prepared because my hands are full with 2 kids. So my brain is full with 2 kids. But of course, like every one of us, have been thinking a lot about, this idea of time, but I would say mobility more than time. There's something for me that is starting to be clear. I think the first, I'm going to put some time on also. But the first months I was just in a state of sideration. So that lasted a month in order to kind of readjust, with what was going on. And we are still confined for another week. And next week in France, we're all out. We are becoming like rats, laboratory rats for the government. basically to see if the pandemic is going to take over again or not. And so basically they're asking us to move again. So this idea of mobility for me is the main concern, in the sense that I've been thinking already since 2 years about staying in one place more and being more active within where I am at the moment, which is, so where I said before, in this village, 400 people. And what can I do? And everything starting to make more sense since 2 years about how much I can actually have some sort of impact without moving anywhere, without traveling, without taking planes, and it's not so much about an environmental issue, rather than feeling some sense of what can I do. What I see, who is very strange for me right now, with my friends who are in Paris, and who can't move at all. I mean, I have the privilege to be in the countryside, but what is said is that basically the people who are actually moving now, who are actually in mobility, are the people who are in the street working. And they are the people who are, what we say in French is racisés, who are people who are people of color. I don't know how you, racisé is really like a new French term in terms of saying people who are poor, people who are in the street, people who are working for the people who stay at home. Okay, people who are meaning garbage, so it's kind of like, it's almost this kind of switch about who is moving right now and who is confined. And we are all confined and we are safe. But the people who are actually moving now and who are in the street, they're the people who are working for us. So for me, this is like a real big kind of shift in terms of mobility. And I read an article of Paul Preciado about shamanism, and this is, and in terms of COVID, and how he said that this is also a moment where we could have that basically this is kind of a renewal, the possibility of a renewal, like kind of a shamanic ritual that can happen right now, and that we have to take the opportunity for that. Of some sort of a renewal. And he was saying how much for him it's an interesting thing to that this sickness that this virus is attacking basically white people around 70 years old, and how much this is like the Occident is like mainly attack. And how there is like this kind of switch right now with everything. And for me, this switch is like, was necessary. We had to stop. We just had to stop. And so this is where I am in the reflection of things right now. Like Jackline, it's a big mess with a lot of information too, and a lot of different kind of things. So it's very complicated, but things are starting to be, sharper. And especially since we're supposed to déconfiner, we said in French, out shelter, in 1 week, and it's going to be a big mess. So, voilà. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Isa. Alejandro.
Hey, I'm here. Timer as well. I have my post-it notes here. I think for me, one of the things that stands out is Annie and Jennifer and I started informally discussing sort of a roundtable around the pandemic and around some of the issues that stuck out. And for me, what I brought to that conversation, or one of the sparks that really has been on my mind following the news, following the spread around the world of this, is just how much this pandemic is, it speaks to our moment, it speaks to our time, and that sort of late capitalism and sort of that neoliberal sense of we are all individuals. And so here's this pandemic, and here's this response that says, to defeat this, to defeat this enemy, using some of that language, we must isolate, we must break those bonds of community, break those bonds of connection that we have. You're on your own, people. And then in so many ways, the response of the state has been as well, or the response of the nation has been to say, well, you're on your own. You know, in New York, we don't care if you live or die. This is terrifying stuff. So in that mix as well, I started thinking about Vine Deloria's Jr. His God is Red, and he's musing on this relationship of space and place and time as a Eurocentric imposition, really. This idea that time is this measurement that comes in this framework, but we're bound, we relate to each other spatially. So within that, I think about myself as a Chicano, living, working, writing on Ohlone land, naming that positionality, thinking of how do I relate to one another? How do I build this sense of community? How do we, through this virtual sphere, how do we find those spaces for community to recognize that fragility, that danger that's very real there, but also to find those spaces for hope. And a lot of those questions, I think that's been the conversation that I've been hearing through this. I've been writing a bunch of Post-it notes just to kind of keep track of some of these wonderful ideas and things that are coming into my mind. How do we shift our mindset away from this notion of productivity, that we are always producers, that we are these cogs in the machine? And this is a very, very Fordian imposition upon ourselves, upon what we do, whether it's intellectual labor, physical labor, the labor of care. How do we shift ourselves from that and use this crisis as that breaking point, not to repeat what was there, not to rebuild what was there, but to recognize these are the possibilities, these are the things that can happen, these are the new ways or the old ways in a lot of aspects of being, of ways of being. So I'll stop there. I know I still have some time, but I'm eager to get into this conversation. Thank you.
Jen?
Hi. Okay, that's a very elegant transition, because so much of my sort of chaotic rambling comments really echo what Alejandro was saying. I'm also going to start a timer, but like Alejandro, I have been thinking about these issues mainly through this collective space where Annie and Alejandro and I have been writing down some ideas. So I'm just going to kind of share some maybe not super related reflections that's come out of these conversations between the three of us. The first thing that I've been reflecting on a lot is comparing this state of exception with the other two states of exception that I've experienced in my adult life. The first one was 9/11, when I was an undergraduate at NYU and living very close to the World Trade Center on the day of 9/11. The other state of exception that I experienced was the 15th of July in 2016, when I was living in Ankara, Turkey. And that was the day where there was an attempted military coup that ultimately failed. Ankara was one of the epicenters of the coup attempt. There was bombings of government buildings not too far from where I was living at the time. So I'm kind of thinking about issues of time and space and states of exception through the lens of those two experiences and also this one. One thing that I've really noticed is that both with 9/11 and with the failed military coup, my response to those moments of crisis was to go somewhere else. And I had the privilege to be able to do that. There was about 48 hours after the military coup where foreigners living in Turkey, we didn't know if we could leave the country or not, but we were free to move around within the country. And I went to a seaside town to get out of Ankara. 9/11, I went with my college roommate up to her parents' house outside of New York City. The difference is here I am in Spain and I can't go anywhere. The quarantine measures are very strict here in Spain. We can't leave our residences unless, we're going for food shopping, medical appointments. Just this week, they've allowed us to go out for 60 minutes of recreational time, but it's only during certain windows of the day. It's still very, very regulated. So it's interesting for me to think about, you know, how my previous responses were to move, right? And I had the freedom and the privilege to do that. And I'm still in a place of privilege here in Spain, but my mobility is restricted. It's also interesting, my experience of this is interesting because this pandemic coincided with my move to Spain. I had only come here a few weeks before the pandemic started. And it was my transition into working from home kind of full time. So all of that was just starting for me. And then this pandemic hit, and then we were in quarantine. So one thing I've also been thinking about is this image of the mobility of the expat. We often associate the expat, the American expat, and all of the genres around American expats with a sense of mobility, right, and privilege. And there is, it's just interesting to me that in that sense right now, I don't feel the mobility of being an expat, but I feel but the restriction of the quarantine measures, which of course are necessary. But I don't feel so much like the mobile expat, right? I feel like an outsider to this place who is now always inside my domestic space. And so in this transition where now I'm constantly home and I'm constantly working from the home space, like Alejandro, I've been experiencing this pressure, right, from capitalism to be always on, to be always producing. And the time between hours when you're supposed to work and hours when you are enjoying time with your family have been completely blurred, as we know. And instead of, it's interesting for me to note that even though, you know, I'm not going to an office from 9 to 5 every day, I feel as if the demands of capitalism are actually amplified during this time, right? And I feel this constant need to produce. And with that also comes guilt over not producing. And I'm thinking, like, why can't I write? And I've turned to other ways to explore, that's my time, explore my ability to respond to this creatively. For me, that's been through dance, movement, and meditation. And I'll end there.
And our Daphne. We can't.
Okay, thanks. Yep, I just unmuted myself.
Great.
Okay, so thanks. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
So what has been my focus through this pandemic, even though there's all these other demands and, you know, there's all these other expectations, what has been at my focus are the efforts that people are involved in to create a better world. Although charity and social services are crucial, it's those who are organizing to affect change at a structural level during this time that are especially, you know, inspiring to me, and that I've been trying to pay closer attention to, and, you know, have been involved myself in trying to build on these efforts. As a child, my mom, my brother, and I lived for a year in a homeless shelter. It was the experiences that I had in that multi-room facility where we shared a kitchen with other families that would shape some of my early political consciousness around housing. The fact that access to safe, secure, and stable housing was tied to a racist and sexist exploitative job market was a first sign to me that something wasn't quite right about the world we lived in. And housing, as a couple people have mentioned, has emerged as a public health issue during this pandemic in a way that I hadn't seen before, and that it sounds like perhaps others haven't seen before either. To the point where here in California that the state government was openly talking about the fact that homeless people are more vulnerable to the harsher effects of COVID-19, and even went so far as to rent thousands of Motel 6 hotel rooms to house homeless people here. And so, you know, this response to the pandemic raised several questions, right? And so one of the first ones, of course, that came up for me was, why wasn't this done before? If there were, you know, if there are sudden resources to be able to accomplish this, you know, massive effort, why had nothing parallel or even approaching that, you know, been done before? And other questions that came up were, does putting a homeless person in an empty room, does it adequately protect them from a public health crisis? What conditions were they facing that led to their homelessness in the first place? And so these questions had me thinking about what is home, and it brought back, you know, memories of my own experiences as a child, and later on, you know, through living in public housing. And so a home is a time-bound historical process that we both inherit and create. It is both the people in the home and the building structure. To be at home is to be in relation with the people, the furniture, the neighbors, etc. It is where one dwells. But in this modern colonial capitalist system, the home has been turned into a source of revenue for investors and developers. The transience of our inhabitants is written into the contracts and how we can or cannot relate to the building itself. Our family members and neighbors come and go, pursuing jobs and schooling, are moved around against their will because of public housing policy or because landlords decide it. And sometimes we end up homeless because affordable housing is just not available. And these issues are embedded in the very construction of housing, from the neighborhoods that are selected for investment or abandonment, the materials that are used, to the colors that are selected. What I want to emphasize here is the human relationships that are made possible or impossible in our current context. And what I shared with the group was a link to a video that was made by an organization in Oakland, California. The organization is called Moms for Housing. And they have, you know, created a very successful campaign to, first of all, reclaim a house in Oakland that was empty for months because it had been purchased at auction by a real estate investment company, an investment company that specializes in distressed housing, quote unquote. And you know, so they were buying up all these properties and supposedly they were going to renovate them and put them back on the market, but keeping them empty for prolonged periods of time. I'm assuming waiting for the most profitable moment to begin the process of renovation and selling. And so they took over one of these houses and, you know, successfully, you know, galvanized a number of people, you know, to come out and help them with issues of security, to protest, to, you know, talk to city officials. And, you know, they used texting, phone calls, social media, and Zoom. And so one of the things that has really emerged for me during this time is how distances of space, especially in different cities, has been changed in fundamental ways in terms of how we're seeing each other as potential organizing partners. You know, so for example, Moms for Housing organized an international call with an organization in London, England, called Focus E15. That was also a housing movement, primarily of families also who were living in public housing contexts. And, you know, working with people, bringing people from, you know, all over the world, really, you know, to come and talk about housing and how it has, how, you know, the similar issues are facing people all over the world for connected reasons, right? And so identifying the connections, right? Identifying the differences and thinking about how we can move forward, you know, in this kind of project. And so the final word that we left with that meeting was that if it's empty, take it. If it's empty and you're homeless, take it. And then, of course, building a network around that, you know, and doing the necessary work that's needed, you know, in order to make sure that the people who are doing this work are safe, that are taking the houses are safe. And so I will leave it with that.
Wow, thank you everyone for your wonderful sharings. I'm going to now pass the facilitation to Dalida. We're going to open it up, and Dalida and I can kind of back and forth on this part, but we'd love to, Dalida, did you want to say anything before we open it up? So let's, yeah.
And just to thank everyone for you're just such amazing contributions to the conversation. And I love too that we've ended or begun this next phase on this note of interconnection across distances and precisely on the politics of home, which I feel like has also resonated so in such an interesting ways across everyone's talks. And across the texts, the diverse texts that you shared with us. With that, maybe I'll just ask who has an urgent question that they would like to pose, or a response that you'd like to pose to anyone else's thoughts. And maybe too, I might even ask that like we practice a bit of radical unmuting.
Let's do it. Let's all unmute.
Because I think as we were talking, and particularly about time, and this has occurred to me before, that there's a kind of like sequencing of our speech that happens when we're on these platforms. And I think it might be interesting to kind of like bump into each other a bit more.
So now let's everyone unmute. Go ahead, please.
Yeah.
Please.
Okay. Yeah, so you don't have to, but I'm just saying it could be fun.
I can unmute them for them if
jump in.
You might hear my dog barking hysterically at some point.
Wonderful. Species, family members, everyone welcome.
I actually have a question. Can I ask a question?
Go for it, yes.
So those who are living in France and Spain, it sounds like there are very different approaches happening. Jennifer, you were saying in Spain that the restrictions are, pretty extreme, that you haven't even been able to go outside for a walk or that sort of thing. And then Isabel, it sounded like everything's being lifted next week, which sounds like the opposite of what's going on not far from you. So what's happening there?
Las diferencias que España aplicó una restricción muy dura, porque al parecer tenían que haberla aplicado unos días antes, entonces la aplicaron, en el momento que la aplicaron fue muy duro y estuvimos realmente encerrados, muy encerrados. Pero en medio del encierro surgió muy rápidamente una gran red, casi que yo diría que en el estado, pero en Cataluña seguro, de redes de apoyo con listas de Telegram y WhatsApp. Entonces eso, además de la salida a los balcones para aplaudir y de las canciones en balcones, y eso ha dado un sentido de comunidad en el aislamiento, pero la restricción ha sido muy dura. Creo, no sabría compararlo porque fue así aquí y de otra manera.
Anyely's just saying that when the restrictions came in, it was this moment, certainly in the European Union, that the focus was on like the south, so like Italy, Spain, was being accused, I'm adding now, sorry, was being accused of being this kind of focus of contagion in Northern Europe. And so they implemented a very like harsh, I would say authoritarian quarantine, which, yeah, I mean, you were allowed to go out to buy things from the pharmacy or the supermarket. And if you were caught in the street without a receipt, a recent receipt, you could be fined up to 3,000 euros. And so people, were bringing home these fines from the police. And of course, the amount of times that we've seen, who's getting stopped by police. We live in a quite kind of migrant, mostly Arab and Muslim neighborhood. And there's just, there's also been a problem. I'm just translating you, sorry. So yeah, we've been very like enclosed. And at the same time, very quickly, these networks of support were kind of activated through WhatsApp and Telegram and in our neighborhoods. Just really incredible kind of distribution of resources, because there are a lot of like single mothers who haven't been allowed to go. They can't even go to the supermarket because they can't go with their kids, and they can't leave the kids at home. So we've had, we've brought like water to people who don't have their water connected, but all of this kind of, the activation was very quick and very like characteristic of the kind of long histories here of community and cooperative organizing at the level of the neighborhood. So
I really enjoy the 8 o'clock applauso. In fact, we were muted, but we could have heard it at 8 o'clock, which is about 15 minutes ago. Yeah. Here, I'm in Bilbao in the Basque region, but it's been a fascinating way to experience a community with these neighbors that I don't know. I hadn't had time to introduce myself to, and it's also been an interesting way to think about how we move our bodies through that public-private space that is the balcony, right? It's sort of this real liminal zone, right, between the public and the private. And before we were doing the 8 o'clock clapping, I was very hesitant to go out on the balcony because people can see you, right? But it's really changed my relationship to that space. Like I mentioned, I think as a result of having this bodily interaction that's not quite an interaction with the neighbors, I've been transforming that balcony into a space for a dance practice and dance meditation, which also gets observed by my neighbors across the street. And so it's this really interesting, way of, they're sort of participating in my dancing without really participating. And we've established a sort of a nonverbal communication across the balconies. So again, it's just fascinating to think about how this applause, the ritual of the applause, is working through the liminal space of the balcony.
The balcony story in France is that it was a bit controversial because it was mainly to start with for the people who are like taking care of the sick one, and most of the people who are working in hospital, they were right before the confinement all on strike for years, at least for 2 years. Just because there is no support, no nothing. I mean, in terms of like equipment, in terms of care, it's a disaster in France. It's like, more than 2 years. And then suddenly they are like, heroes, and it's been really like kind of a joke, in some way to do this. So now the balcony story has kind of moved on, but it's been totally insane what's going on. I mean, the confinement is ending next week, and again, what's happening right now is that the government is kind of doing a test with reopening the school. Okay, so they're reopening they're leaving the university closed until September, but they're reopening all the small schools because what they want people to go back to work. Okay, they want us to go back to work. They want the economy to start again. So they want people who have kids to, put them back to school in order for people to work. And that's so what's going on right now in terms of like kind of a common confrontation with this is that people don't want to put back their kids to school. And it's kind of becoming a movement right now where people are starting to realize that they're being laboratory rats, that there are experimentation. We are an experimentation to put back our kids, even though, we can't stand them anymore. We want to put them back to school, but, and that's the thing, they know we want to just strangle them. But in the same time, it's like, that I feel like there is a consciousness that is, raising among the people saying, no, we're not going to do that. So what the government is doing right now is they're putting it back onto the responsibility of the mayor of each town to take the decision, because they don't want to take the decision. And it's just really insane, how much capitalism and neoliberalism is just so out there and so transparent right now. It's but I really feel like there is a consciousness of this. It's so obvious, and it's of course within the left, the left kind of people, but also with everybody who has kids. And for me, this is also why I put the kids, video, because they are becoming the kind of an interesting component to what's happening right now, which is that, okay, they're the one who are not so-called transmitting really the virus, but they are the one who are touching the most people, and nobody knows how to deal with those, monsters who are touching everything, So it's like they're on the front right now. They're really on the front of the whole thing. And I really feel like there is really something, some sort of something is happening right now where people say, no, we're not going to put them back in school. We are not going to go back to work just because you want the economy to start again. Just to answer your question, Daphne, a bit.
What I find interesting is probably not the word I want to use. What I find terrifying is just the scope of what bodies are expendable, what bodies can be sacrificed, who is at risk here. And it's Governor Abbott, Texas, a few weeks ago speaking, and he was saying, I'm in this elderly risk population and I'm willing to sacrifice myself so the economy can be booming again. I think that's what all grandparents should do. I'm, of course, paraphrasing here, not his exact words, but more or less his sentiment that's then been picked up and circulated. This idea of what bodies is the system willing to throw on this altar for the economy, this idea of the economy working for everyone. But Daphne, I appreciated how you talked about, you said something along the lines of everything that we wanted to have happen, all these things, now this is showing us just what could be done. Why weren't these hotel rooms made available? I find some irony that Motel 6, which was surveilling immigrants and reporting, now all of a sudden they're allies in this kind of cause. But more to the point, what were these possibilities? How has this just shown us, and what's the momentum can we build from that when we, in the United States, all of a sudden have $1 trillion to bail out big corporations and big businesses? Well, where's another $1 trillion for universal health care? Where's another $1 trillion for small schools and for public transportation, where you're not just packed in like sardines in a can? And if we're going to practice social distance, where's another $1 trillion to make sure we have clean water? And I think these are those flashpoints to say, well, here's this precedent, which we know the precedent in the other way. We know the precedent in terms of closing down the borders, in terms of blaming people coming into the country for spreading disease, in terms of practicing those kinds of controls under the name of public health. And I think this gives us a real tangible material way to say, no, there's another way of being.
I really liked what you were saying, Jacqueline, in this very clear phrase of what was once radical is now viable, which is, I think there's parts of that in all of what everyone said to me. It's like we can't unsee what has been happening, like what's being visibilized, surfaced as a viable option.
Yeah, I mean, I guess for me, I've been also thinking about how, in looking at the pandemic as a portal, looking at how the pandemic has managed to magnify all these inequalities, whether it is in global health policy, for example. Most of you are talking about, say, being in some form of curfew or lockdown. And like, for example, the World Health Organization has all these recommendations in terms of how to curb the spread of the virus. But yet in many countries in the global south, these options aren't really options. So for example, self-isolation or this idea of being in one place, and the idea of being in, so essentially the idea of housing as well, and how many people are not really self-isolating, rather they are more like crowding into a small space. And even just looking at different systems of oppression. So for example, I've been thinking about the intersections of the lockdown and the patriarchy, with the increase in domestic violence that cuts across different countries, and how the pandemic, how our experiences are the same and different at the same time, and how the approaches are also different in terms of organizing. So for example, you talk about people not wanting to take their children back, or ideas around opening up the economies. In economies, and I'll speak to, say, Uganda, for example, where the informal sector takes up, where majority of the population is in the informal sector, and what that looks like. And then when it comes to and the actual experiences of someone who's under lockdown. So for example, we have a curfew and some sort of a lockdown that has been on for the last month and is still going. And now the president is giving some sort of address currently. And just like all these effects, and how global health policies that most of the African countries have copied and pasted don't actually work for the population, because all of them are, and this also goes back to the question of representation. Who is sitting on these boards, and who is in the room when who is coming up, when the World Health Organization is coming up with all these policies? Are they looking at are they looking at a gender-specific approach to the virus? Are they looking at how different countries with different economies and different cultures are approaching? And just this question of representation, and I guess thinking about all these inequalities being magnified, and going back to Ondatiori's essay on the pandemic as a portal, I've been thinking that maybe this is the time when everyone's like waking up and saying, well, look, if we say lockdown is not actually applicable in majority of the cities in Africa. If we say self-isolation, that doesn't really also work. And if we say curfew, what is the relationship that citizens have with the police, for the army, who is getting, and all these ideas, and at the end of the day, hopefully, I'm thinking that as a global community will emerge from this pandemic with more viable solutions that are very centered around evidence and lived experiences from people around the world, and also the idea that we can all from a different places come together and have this conversation as well, and share experiences, and maybe that once we are removed out of this, we at least know what's happening. I know what's happening in France, I know what's happening in China, and then come back with all that knowledge and say, well, look, that doesn't work and that works. And maybe, hopefully, I don't know, that we'll have more gender specific approaches to pandemics, but also reviewing what elements of capitalism, if that's even a thing, that work, and what we can learn from each other. Yeah.
I think I'll add one more comment here that you know, I've begun thinking that the pandemic drew into relief for me that you know, this is just, I'm sort of riffing and thinking out loud that you know, we've got some stuff about state of exception here, and my thinking has shifted a bit now that what this draws into relief for us is that, you know, late stage capital as we knew it was not a new form of power, but an interregnum between, say, this rise or this fall of feudalism and what comes after this pandemic now. I think that it's important for us to continue to ask questions about, like, well, how are things going to be rewritten after that, but how are they also changing in front of us? And I'm just continuing to try to deal with this horror that what came before us, right, might have actually been interregnum rather than power, and that that late stage capital was a space of something yet to come. And the other comment that I wanted to make was that I spent some time working with child migrants in Tucson, in I guess what we could call like a safe house, where ICE used to have a deal with migrants where if they declared themselves at the border, they would give them a free bus, a subsidized bus ticket to go wherever they wanted, as long as they declared themselves, and then agreed to go to an immigration hearing 30 days later. We, of course, told them to not attend those hearings. But I worked with a scholar at the University of Arizona who really encouraged me to think about the perspective of youth and children in all of this. And I'm reminded of Bell Hooks, who has an article called Theory is Liberation, I think, where she says that you know, children are some of the best resources we have theoretically and in terms of praxis, because their subjectivities haven't been fully formed yet. They haven't been fully sort of interpolated into these systems that are have completely sedimented. So what are the perspectives that children can bring and that youth can bring that you know, we ourselves cannot see? So thanks.
Thank you. That was really beautiful. And I'm just thinking now about this question of portal and threshold, and also of Michelle's Latipa's piece, the archive gold, and your lovely evocation of that. You know, thinking about our ancestors and thinking about those who have yet to be born, and how can we think about those interconnections across time. It just feels so important now to be seeking other logics than the ones that are being presented to us as the dominant logics. And I think each one of your contributions really evoked so powerfully a different logic, a different opportunity to think. So I think we're going to close now, but I want to invite everyone to you know, continue the conversation, and also the platform, the migratorytimes.net platform, was created to sustain conversations like this one. So all of the work that you've shared is on the site, and there's also the capacity for us to publish more things if you're interested in sending us more writing, more images, and also there's the capacity to comment on the work that's on the site. So I really warmly invite you to continue in those ways. And I also want to, again, thank all of you so much for spending this time in conversation.
Yeah.
And I also really want to thank Anyely Fukushima for all of your organizing work on this. Anyely really took the lead and did just an amazing amount of work to make this happen. Thank you,
Well,
Anyely.
I want to thank you all for showing up. You all did the work. I got to enjoy it, hear your wonderful words, and thank you, everyone. People are doing construction. Apparently, that is seen as essential during pandemic, and so we have a lot of construction going on right now where I live. So it's been an interesting reality that we all inhabit, and I thank you all for sharing your wisdom. And we will be editing this into a video, and you will have a chance to cut things, to do what you need to do if you feel like you would like some other thing to be in there or to be removed from the video. So that will be coming at some point. I can't promise a time just yet. But yeah, thank you everyone for your sharing. And so with that, and I want to thank folks who called in, who joined us by sound. They're tuning in. And please share this once this is posted. Please do circulate it with friends to see what the conversations, the different flash sharings that I think are inspirational. There's a lot of inspiration, hope, reality, future envisioning that we can think through with a lot of the works that you've all have shared. So thank you, everyone. We'll be in touch. We can all say bye. Oh, thank you.
Bye.
Yeah.
Thanks
Good
so
meeting
much.
you all. Seeing you.
Wonderful meeting everyone.
Likewise.
Bye.
Adios.
Adios.
Ciao, ciao.
Ciao, ciao.